Most of the time on this channel, we're celebrating victories. We're celebrating teams that have a journey to a championship. But today, we're doing something a little different. We're looking for the worst, and we're celebrating the worst. The teams with the worst record, the worst stories, we're celebrating those today. All in our search for the worst MLB team. This is Connie Mack, manager and owner of the Philadelphia Athletics for over 40 years. During Connie Mack's tenure, the Athletics experienced some of the highest of highs any baseball franchise in history had, winning championships in 1910, 1911, and 1913. But we're not here to see winning. We're here to see losing. And that's exactly what happened in 1916. This chart shows every win and loss of the 1916 Athletics season. Each one is a different length, showing margin of victory or margin of defeat. Each of these has a story, and to understand these stories, we have to figure out how we got here. So, what happened to Connie Mack's dynasty? Connie Mack was never the richest owner in baseball, and it didn't help that in years after his 1913 championship, a new baseball league rose to prominence. The Federal Baseball League provided the MLB with some serious competition, as they were offering players big contracts, and the Athletics were one of these teams that couldn't compete with all this money. So Connie Mack had to cut costs, and he did that by dumping almost all of his players. The 1916 Athletics only kept two starters from the 1913 team. Those guys, Stuffy McInnis and Jimmy Walsh, were the only two guys left from that starting lineup. The rest of the players were sold off by Connie. My favorite weird move the Athletics made in the time period between 1913 and 1916 was buying Hall of Famer Naplin Joy from the Cleveland Indians. When you look at the bare bones of this trade, it looks like a good move. You're getting a Hall of Famer and former Triple Crown winner. But when you take a closer look, you can see that this man is 41 years old and is way past his prime. I struggle to see the use of getting a 40-year-old man on a team that is trying to build a future. But yet again, this is the 1916 Athletics, and good moves don't seem to matter to them. Now this brings us back to our chart, the chart that shows all 36 wins and 117 losses. There's a specific month and a specific game I want to talk about. This date is July 1st, and little did the Athletics know that on this day they'll be kicking off one of the worst Julys in MLB history. The Athletics finished July with a 2-28 record, the second worst month in MLB history. The only other team ever to have a worse month than the 1916 Athletics was the 1988 Baltimore Orioles, and they were gloriously bad in their own right, with a 1-22 April. Now that you know just how bad the Athletics were in that July, I want to look at a specific game from that month. Our story starts on the south side of Chicago in Comiskey Park, where the Philadelphia Athletics are set to play the Chicago White Sox in a doubleheader that afternoon. The White Sox were riding high into this game. With an assortment of stars led by Shoeless Joe Jackson, they were ready to beat down on the Athletics once again, as they beat them twice the day before in another doubleheader. The pitcher for the Athletics in the first game was Red Lanning, a 21-year-old pitcher who played 1 year in the majors with an ERA plus of 35. The pitcher for the White Sox was Eddie Cicotte, who had a 15-year career in the majors and an ERA plus of 156 that season. So right off the bat, looking at the most basic numbers, the Athletics are already at a disadvantage. But it didn't look like that when the players took the field, as the Athletics were the first to score in the top of the first, and Red Lanning held the White Sox to 0 runs in the bottom of the first. The little hope the Athletics had was quickly squashed when they gave up 5 runs in the bottom of the second, followed by 2 runs in the bottom of the third. From then on, it was no contest, as the White Sox were able to score 3 runs going down the stretch, winning the first game of the doubleheader. May I remind you, this is the deadball era, where a team on average scored 3.9 runs with 8.4 hits and .15 home runs. That is the exact opposite of what the White Sox did in the first game on July 30th. With 19 hits, 10 runs scored, and a home run, they absolutely beat up the Athletics. This is a glorious, top-notch, worst team performance. The second game of the day didn't go any better, as the Athletics once again lost to the White Sox. This time, they lost 7-0. This might have been a terrible day to be an Athletics fan, but it certainly wasn't the worst thing that happened to them that day. In 1916, the world was in the throes of World War I, and the US hadn't yet entered the war. However, they were still sending supplies to their allies over in Europe. Sending supplies to their allies like England was actively hurting the other side, Germany and Austria-Hungary. So they decided to take action and attack some of these supplies on the US mainland. That attack happened on July 30th, 1916, where German operatives blew up a bunch of supplies in Black Tom's Island in New Jersey. At the time, citizens didn't know it was German operatives, but they could speculate it, and it only heightened the fear of the war. Usually, in times of fear and stress, you have sports to look to. But the Athletics fans that were in Philadelphia and New Jersey who this impacted didn't have that. That was until Philadelphia had their next home game, where they were able to beat Ty Cobb's Detroit Tigers 7-1. For the people in attendance and the people reading the news, this gave them a small moment of relief. And at the end of the day, this distraction is ultimately what sports are meant for. With that thought, we're going to close the book and submit the ballot for the Athletics being one of the most glorious losers of all time. Now we're going to shift gears and go nearly 50 years into the future to see how a couple moves to the West Coast conceived one of the worst MLB teams of all time. In the 1950s, New York City was the baseball capital, with the Brooklyn Dodgers, the New York Giants, and the New York Yankees, and star-studded talents like Mickey Mantle, Jackie Robinson, and Willie Mays. New York was on the top of the baseball world during the 50s. Enter California. The booming state wanted a baseball team, so they decided to entice the Giants and the Dodgers to come play in California by offering them a new stadium and a brand new platform to play on. Long story short, the two teams decide to accept the offer and leave New York, each of them going to different cities. The Dodgers went to LA, and the Giants went to San Francisco. That left New York City without an NL team. Now flash to July 27th, 1959. In an effort to bring more baseball back into the city, New York attorney William Shea founded the Continental League. The league would consist of teams located throughout the whole country, but most notably, it would have a team in New York. In response to this, the MLB decided to create two expansion franchises, one in each league, the NL and the AL. How does this solve the problem, you might ask? Well, they offered the owners of the New York Continental League team ownership over the new NL expansion team. Of course, the owners accepted. This essentially killed off the Continental League, as the only reason the league was created in the first place was to fill the void left by there being no NL team in New York City. William Shea had completed his mission and brought NL baseball back to New York. With the expansion team in place, New York was ready to start building their new NL team. For starters, the team needed a name and a logo. They decided to call themselves the Mets, and in an homage to the Giants and Dodgers, formerly in New York, they combined the two logos of those teams and created their own logo. Using the orange NY from the Giants and the blue from the Dodgers logo, they created their own brand new New York Mets logo. With the logo sorted out, it was time for the Mets to build their actual team. The two expansion teams, the other being the Houston Colt 45s, were going to participate in an expansion draft to build out their rosters. An expansion draft in the 1960s was more or less a pool of unwanted, bad or old players that were released from their old teams, so two new teams can pick these players and have a roster. You'd think when participating in this draft, you'd want to build a young roster with lots of winning potential, right? Well, that's not exactly what the Mets did. That's when this story went from a fairy tale winning one to a glorious losing one. See, the Mets' strategy wasn't to draft the youngest team, the team with the most potential, or even the best team. It was to draft a team that people would know. This resulted in the Mets drafting old washed-up players who were years past their prime. They drafted players like former Dodger star 38-year-old Gil Hodges with the 14th pick. To make matters worse, Gil would only play 65 lifetime games for the Mets. They drafted a 38-year-old who was only going to play for them for 65 games. Oh, and remember when you were surprised that the 1916 Athletics had a Hall of Famer? Well, this team has one too. The Mets bought Hall of Famer and Philly legend Richie Ashburn from the Chicago Cubs. It's a strange move, as the Mets already have a bunch of aging players. But hey, it's another face for the fans to recognize. Those two moves I mentioned were only one of the many strange moves the Mets made. But here's the very best one. On April 25th, 1962, the Mets traded for Cleveland catcher Harry Cheedy. What they gave the Indians was a player to be named later. But after 15 games with a 195 batting average, the Mets thought Harry Cheedy was so bad that they made him the player to be named later. Harry Cheedy got traded for himself. This is the first time this happened in MLB history. And it just goes to show how inconsistent and strange this Mets front office was. With the roster complete, the Mets needed a stadium to play in. And while their future stadium, Shea Stadium, is being built, they need a temporary one. They were going to play in Polo Grounds, the former home of the Giants. And as if this team couldn't get any more unique, these are the dimensions of Polo Grounds. Finally, after all of that, the Mets were finally ready to be gloriously bad in 1962. Unsurprisingly, the Mets started off the season with a 9-game losing streak. That was until the 10th game, where pitcher Jay Hook threw a complete game and was the first pitcher in Mets history to win a game. In college, Jay Hook wrote an essay about the science behind a curveball, even if it was still a little unclear if he could actually throw one. In 1962, the Mets have many great losses. I could talk about those games all day, but what these games really do is put into motion some of these statements. The Mets had 40 wins and 120 losses. That's an AL record for most losses in a season. The Mets committed 210 errors. They were the first team since 1950 to commit 200 errors in one season. The Mets had multiple pitchers who lost 20 or more games. Nevertheless, the fans supported the 1962 Mets. and the Mets are known as one of the most loved worst teams of all time. The question is, can you give the worst team title to a team that was loved and gave a city more baseball? Can you even give the title to a team that distracted people and played during a wartime? The question is, I don't know. But the one thing I do know is that this clip perfectly sums up the 1962 Mets season.
The Keystone combo of Chacon and Neal chalked up plenty of double plays, but they had more chances than anyone else. For when the game was over, the amazing Mets were usually far behind.
We say goodbye to our old 1900s teams with sadness, but we say hello to our 2000s teams with great joy. We are ready to begin a new millennia of losing, a brand new era of losing.